Before I begin, I'd like to preface by saying that much of the content of this video is graphic. Imagery and discussions of potentially distressing topics will be featured. In my last video, I discussed the visual symbol of the draconic serpent as employed by contemporary Swedish black metal bands, along with the themes of medievalism, death, misanthropy, and religion. Much of these same ideas will be hinted at in this video essay. However, the bands in this video aren't unified by their country of origin, rather by the subgenre of extreme metal that they play. That being said, not all metal scene members agree that these bands belong to a distinct subgenre per se, despite similarities and sonic elements that differentiate them. For the purposes of this video and the visual analysis of these bands, I will act under the assumption that the bands are part of a particular extreme metal subgenre. Blasphemy, Weregoat, Goatsmegma, Impurity, Abvolnashi, and Bestial Warfare are bands that play a brand of extreme metal that blurs the lines between death metal, black metal, and thrash metal in a manner similar to black and death metal. War metal, or bestial black metal, is raw, lo-fi, abrasive, and savage, even by the standards of extreme metal, and I will argue in this video that these elements carry over through the lyrics and imagery of these bands. In fact, it could be said that these elements all converge. In his article on metal album covers, Vestergaard suggested that, quote, with the inclusion of music, the album could be viewed as a Gesamtkunstwerk, where the auditive and visual parts are inseparably intertwined in complex intermedial relationships, end quote. He also suggests including the analysis of lyrics, merchandise, and more in dissecting and explaining aspects of extreme metal. This video, and in part my first video, are an attempt to apply this strategy. So, what is a Gesamtkunstwerk? The word generally translates to total artwork, or, quote, a work of art that makes use of all or many art forms or strives to do so, end quote. Taking an album with its lyrics and artwork together certainly fits this idea, and in turn it implies a relationship between the various parts that act cohesively. Simply put, the music, lyrics, vocals, and artwork are each a piece of the puzzle, and each individual piece tells its own story. As previously stated, the subject of this video is the imagery of a few bands associated with the war metal subgenre, and specifically their use of the goat or man-goat as a visual symbol. Before delving into the goat symbol as used by these bands, or even the goat more broadly in metal imagery, I shall briefly talk about the goat as depicted more generally in human culture to establish some context. There are numerous books on goats in human culture and what they represent, but for the purposes of a shorter video essay, I turn to Joy Hinson's Goat, which offers a general overview that is nonetheless detailed and informative. The symbolic significance of goats is vast, as the domesticated goat has been a feature of human life for thousands of years. However, Hinson summarizes a few key points that are relevant for the subject of this video. In her book, she states that, quote, goats have a symbolic significance. In early pagan cultures, they represented lust and debauchery. In satanic cults, they often represent Satan himself, while in Christian culture, they symbolize sinners, those who have fallen from grace, end quote. Hinson articulates three aspects of the symbolism of goats that each have a role in metal graphic design. Firstly, the goats in pagan pre-Christian Europe. Her analysis is centered on Pan, the Greek goat-man god who, unlike other Greek deities, did not live on Mount Olympus but, quote, rural Arcadia, end quote, which not only connected Pan to the rural countryside, but also made him a symbol of fertility. Hinson reports that, quote, images of Pan often show him with a phallus, and he had a reputation for his sexual appetite, end quote. She goes on to claim that tales featuring Pan often had him attempting to seduce or sexually assault nymphs. Hinson concludes by stating that Pan's fertility cult in Europe, quote, are part of the long association between goats and sexuality, especially with male sexual depravity, end quote. Secondly, Hinson describes this association as it carried on through a medieval European history, fusing with Christian ideas. The association of goats with lust merely deepened and gained an even more evil character as the image of the devil in Christianity gained more goat-like qualities, becoming horned, hoofed, and hairy. Even the word goat came to mean a licentious man, and in the Gospel of Matthew, on the Day of Judgment, it said people will be divided into sheep and goats. The sheep will be rewarded, while the goats will be damned. Speaking especially on the association between the goat and the devil, Hinson reports on a superstition in rural England, saying that, quote, no he-goat ever remains in sight for 24 consecutive hours, because once a day it pays a visit to the devil to have its beard combed, end quote. So, the symbolic significance of the goat is threefold. Firstly, it is associated with lust and male sexual depravity. Secondly, with rebellion. And thirdly, with the devil himself and the occult. These three aspects will be key in interpreting the goat in war metal and extreme metal more generally. Before speaking about war metal bands listed earlier, it might be worth noting that heavy metal has been using the goat symbol at least since the early 1980s. Two outlier bands in the new wave of British heavy metal used goat imagery, and one in particular was keenly associated with extreme metal. Angel Witch, a band with occult lyrics and bluesy music, used the Baphomet figure on their 1980 Sweet Danger release, while the band Venom used not only a goat face on their 1981 Welcome to Hell album cover, but also on the genre-defining Black Metal album cover, which featured a bearded face with goat-like horns. The early imagery of Swedish extreme metal band Bathory also used the goat, notably on the 1984 self-titled album cover, as well as on the 1987 full-length album Under the Sign of the Black Mark. Thus, the association of goats with the occult and Satanism was one harnessed by extreme metal in order to push the transgressive theme of metal even further. Venom are credited for their huge impact on thrash, black, and death metal, and from that point on, I would argue extreme metal was gripped by a sort of arms race, an ambition among extreme metal bands to be as extreme as possible, and different subgenres of extreme metal approached this in varied ways, though they were united by a desire to be as transgressive as possible and make transgressive music. Dr. Keith Kahn-Harris suggests that extreme metal was born of a fundamentalist counter against more mainstream trends in metal, namely the popularity of glam or pop metal in the 1980s. He explains that, quote, fundamentalism implies a disgust at decadence and a desire to return to a perceived state of purity, end quote. In this case, the decadence is the decadence of pop metal. And this all fits in with the claims made by the vocalist of Venom, Conrad Lantz, aka Kronos, as he claims in Dale Patterson's Black Metal Evolution of the Cult book, in which he states, quote, I mean, to me, rock music is the devil's music, end quote, while declaring that bands such as Def Leppard and Samson were, quote, pop music, that is not rock and roll, end quote. Venom felt that metal was missing something, and their aggressive, stripped-down, punk-infused brand of metal was meant to bring it back. There is much to be said of Venom and their influence on extreme metal, but for the purposes of this video, we will take special note of what Patterson calls, quote, primitivism, end quote, and, quote, raw barbarity, end quote, in Venom's music. It is this barbaric quality that the bands to be discussed more specifically in this video share in, and the goat motif is intrinsically tied to this barbarism. Barbarism is at the root of war metal or bestial black metal. To some, war metal is not strictly a subgenre of extreme metal at all. In his video explaining war metal, Wyatt X Him calls war metal a, quote, fan-made genre, end quote, that is, quote, a melting pot of all the extreme metal genres, end quote, meaning the main subgenres, black, death, and thrash, though he also identifies grindcore influences as being involved. Wyatt X Him identifies the German thrash scene, particularly Sodom and Creator, as harbingers of the war metal subgenre. Though he stresses that they were not playing war metal at the time, rather, he rightly praises the early work of these two bands and identifies their influence on black metal. He also traces the history of war metal through the Brazilian extreme metal scene with bands such as Vulcano, Sarcófago, and Sepultura, which were characteristically savage and primitive. For the purposes of this video, the most interesting point he makes is in regard to what he calls an, quote, aggressive and militant, end quote, sound. The celebrated pioneer of war metal, if there is one, is Canada's Blasphemy, which is a point most extreme metal scene members would agree on. In 1990, Blasphemy released Fallen Angel of Doom. Sonically, this release was a definitive album for the coming war metal phenomenon. Wyatt X Him points out, quote, musically and sonically, this, the album, just sounds all the more heinous, barbaric, and over the top. Where all the Brazilian thrash metal bands were cranking the intensity up to 10, Blasphemy went the next level and cranked it to 11, end quote. I'd like to emphasize how Wyatt X Him describes Blasphemy: heinous and barbaric. Barbarism and savagery has already been alluded to, and will be expanded upon, but the use of the word heinous is telling and accurate. One reason why I'd argue war metal is a genre is because the characteristics that unite these bands go beyond sonic qualities. As mentioned earlier, my intention with this video essay was to include an analysis of music, lyrics, and imagery, but other aspects can also be discussed. Like Venom and many bands within the black metal genre, Blasphemy band members adopted pseudonyms, which were lengthy and highlighted themes of occult rituals, sexuality, death, violence, and desecration. Over the years, band members have adopted the following titles within Blasphemy: Nocturnal Grave Desecrator and Black Winds, Three Black Hearts of Damnation and Impurity, Caller of the Storms, Death Lord of Abomination and War Apocalypse, Black Priest of the Seven Satanic Blood Rituals, the Traditional Sodomizer of the Goddess of Perversity, Ace Gestapo, Necrosleazer and Vaginal Commands, and Bestial Savior of the Undead Legions. These pseudonyms have broad commonalities in that they emphasize various similar themes. Metal's preoccupation with power is relevant, and like black metal, many of these titles stress religious functions, but there's also a sexual connotation, more specifically a preoccupation with perverse sexuality. Blasphemy's lyrics also contain these references. Take, for example, a track titled Goddess of Perversity from the aforementioned 1990 Fallen Angel of Doom album. The track contains numerous references to dark and occult subject matter, but also details of sexual activity. Of course, the track has perversity in the title, so that's not so surprising. But it's worth noting the various juxtapositions on display. Perverse sexuality is often coupled with violence and intentional desecration, lustful with damnation, death-blood orgy, countess of lust sadistic whore. The trope of virgins offered as a sort of satanic sacrifice is also mentioned, the track emphasizing 1,000 virgins cry ecstasy and pain. Here, the lyrics paint a picture of innocent sacred victims sacrificed in a violent and sexual manner, even emphasizing their sexual pleasure upon death. There's also a line wherein a holy fetus is desecrated and killed. Before moving on, To the other bands to be discussed and compared, it's worth noting the album cover for this release. Like the album covers featured in my last video, this one provides an image of stark contrast. The album title and band logo are in red, at the bottom and top of the image respectively. The typeface is fairly typical of extreme metal in that it evokes the look of medieval Gothic typefaces. In the center is a line drawing in white of a goat-skulled winged figure pulling back an arrow on a bow. Perhaps this is the fallen angel of doom himself. This would make for a rather direct reference to the devil, taking up arms against the holy enemy that the tracks, like goddess of perversity, have identified. Musically, by bringing bands together into the war metal subgenre, a comparison has been drawn that assumes these groups share sonic characteristics. This is assumed when it comes to musical genre codification, but through their lyrics and visual aesthetic, Blasphemy have also contributed to codifying the war metal subgenre. Blasphemy weren't the only pioneering war metal band that used similar aesthetics. Beherit used an identical color range on many of their earlier releases, including the seminal Oath of Black Blood compilation of 1991. And moreover, they had also been using the motif of a demonic goat man as well. These colors are typical to extreme metal, but it must be highlighted that this alone wasn't the only visual element that was picked up by the war metal bands to come. In particular, the imagery tends to favor white line art against black, and, in departure from the more usual black metal aesthetics, the line art style is decidedly grittier, scratchier, and less like a medieval engraving in comparison. It's often rather crude, intentionally crude, evoking something more like an early 1990s comic book. The scenes depicted on these album covers also began to change, compared to those of earlier extreme metal releases. Previously, the demonic goatman merely posed on these album covers, or perhaps they brandished inverted crosses, or stared threateningly at the viewer. Later, these goatmen were more active, and either depicted involved in gruesome acts of violence, or acts of a sexual nature with human female victims. On some album covers, both gruesome acts of violence as well as sexual activity are depicted. Take, for example, the range of album covers by the two war metal bands Goatsmegma from Estonia and Weregoat from the USA. According to their Metal Archives page, Weregoat have been active since 2009, and the lyrical themes they explore are lycanthropy, sex, demons, violence. In 2011, they released an EP titled Unholy Exaltation of Full Moon Perversity. The album cover depicts a scene wherein a huge monstrous goat man approaches a naked woman on her knees, chained atop a pentagram on the ground in a cave, the goat man's clawed hands reaching for her. On the right and left wall of the cave are two other chained females, both naked. A number of skulls litter the ground around the scene. The color palette is identical to that of Blasphemy's iconic 1990 album. The style of the art is similar, but more in line with the crude and scratchy style outlined previously. Each of the 8 tracks of this EP contain references to sexuality, perversion, violence, and death. There are also references to warfare, which will also be relevant for the discussion of the aesthetics of war metal. Some lines of interest include those on the screen. It's also worth noting that the members of Weregoat also go by pseudonyms, all of which have included references to sexuality. Nocturnal Hellfucker, Sado-Seducer, Obscene Violator, Indiscriminate Impregnator, who left the band in 2014, and Lecherous Aggressor. In 2013, Weregoat released another EP titled Slave Bitch of the Ram Master, which featured another goat man and a naked woman in chains, wherein it appears that the goat man is penetrating the woman on her knees with a crucifix-headed staff. This album cover is more varied in its use of color, but the visual themes have remained consistent. In 2017, Weregoat released their first full-length album, Pestilential Rites of Infernal Fornication. The album cover of which returned to the limited range of colors of black, white, and red. The album cover depicts a monstrous goat man in a sexual act with a naked human woman, both of whom are atop a pentagram painted on the floor, ringed with candles. At least 5 hooded figures watch, and the scene appears to be taking place within a church. The lyrics build upon previously explored themes, though the release is even more graphic, even in track titles such as Goat Lust Invocation, Molested by Evil, screaming forth endless blasphemies and emitting foul seed upon the pitiful face of benevolence, forked tongue lashes between the virgin's thighs, as cold as the devil's seed. I'd also like to draw attention to the band photos for Weregoat. The one found on their Metal Archives profile as well as their Bandcamp page is a photograph wherein 3 members of the band stand over a naked woman upon an altar. One member of the band holds a knife above her chest as if ready to sacrifice her, while the other members glare threateningly at the viewer, brandishing torches. Another photograph to be found on the back of Pestilential Rites of Infernal Fornication's vinyl release depicts a similar scene, wherein one band member is holding a nude woman by her hair, and another is threatening her by placing the blade of a scythe under her neck. Presumably, this image is from the same photoshoot with the same model. Like Blasphemy, Weregoat emphasize rituals of perversion and violence, and they meld together. And just as Hinson points out, the goat man is linked to male sexual depravity, but also to violence. It's worth noting how men are depicted as violent aggressors and women as victims, in states of undress and at the mercy of aggressive male agents. The theme of captivity and domination is also hinted at with these images, but not fully acknowledged, whereas other bands build upon this theme more directly. While not considered a war metal band, the Austrian black and death metal band Vestergaard also use a goat imagery on their album covers, and also delve into themes of violence and sexuality, as well as BDSM and perversion. Next, I shall analyze Goatsmegma from Estonia. Goatsmegma have been active since 2018 and have released 2 full-length albums and 1 split. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any of the lyrics to their music online, so the analysis will be narrowed down to imagery and track and album titles instead. However, on their Metal Archives page, their lyrical themes are listed as violent sex, anti-Christianity. Their first album, Demonic Goatsmegma Eating Ritual, was released in 2019. The album cover depicts 2 humans on hands and knees, a priest and a nun. 3 goatmen are graphically violating these 2 victims anally and orally. It's especially relevant that the victims of this scene are a priest and a nun, as this fits in with the theme of desecration and transgressing against seemingly holy figures. Goatsmegma's second album, Goat Separatist Movement, released in 2022, seemingly continues this trend. The album cover depicts 2 goatmen standing with machine guns in hand. They appear to be AK-47s, and wearing bullet belts. Between them is a human male figure that is not only beheaded, but with a pole penetrating through his rear and neck. His body is also turned upside down, legs in the air, genitals exposed. The flag itself has 2 guns crossed with a goat head atop it. While not explicitly stated, the male victim does bear a resemblance to the more stereotypical image of Jesus, though this can't be confirmed directly by the image itself. The track titles do, however, confirm this violence against holy figures and holiness in general, especially decapitating the holy prisoners and putting the bomb under the church. Other tracks include references to sexual perversions such as coprophilic temptation and drowning into goat sperm, while one reminds us of the stereotypical extreme metal theme of Satanism in enforcing genocide in order to fulfill Lucifer's will. A final note on the two album artworks of Goatsmegma. Both are reportedly the work of Hella-Liisa Aavikko, an illustrator active in the extreme metal scene of Estonia since at least 2013. It's certainly noteworthy that these images of gruesome sexual violence are the work of a woman, and calls into question the stereotypical notion of extreme metal as a male-dominated space. Here, we have a female illustrator participating in building the visual culture of extreme metal through graphic and even seemingly misogynistic imagery. The theme of gender politics is not one to be explicitly discussed in this video, but it might be a topic of future research. Other war metal bands also share in this theme of attacking or otherwise desecrating holy figures and personas. While the cover for Ghost Separatist Movement isn't explicit in identifying the victim as Jesus, one t-shirt design for Impurity, which is also an alternative album cover for Bonfem Mortuarii Mortuis, released in 2017, is clearer. In this design, a demonic goat man with bat wings, an erect phallus with a rosary and cross looped over it, and holding a pitchfork, is leading a captive human male figure. This captive figure is wearing a loincloth and has a crown of thorns on his head, with hobbling chains on his ankles. Impurity are a war metal band from Brazil who have been active since 1988. Looking at their album covers alone, one can see a change in style from about 2004 onwards, where the band seems to have changed their logo and the aesthetics of their album art became more crude and directly transgressive. They adopted a goat man and used this figure on a few of their album covers, and their 2017 full-length depicted three figures with goat-like qualities mutilating a human male figure on a cross. The victim's right hand and right leg have been severed, while another attacker disembowels him. Another example would be Bestial Warfare from Germany, who have been active since 2017 and have released one demo and one EP. On Metal Archives, their lyrical themes are listed as war, darkness, blasphemy, death. The cover for their 2020 EP, Desecrating Goat Assault, once again features a goatman figure hefting a machine gun in his right hand, a bottle in the other, wearing bullet belts on numerous spots all over his body, while in the background a church burns and numerous impaled bodies are being burned as well. In front of him is the head of a human male victim impaled on a spike, the expression that of agony. The male victim is bearded with long hair and wearing a crown of thorns, so this too is likely meant to depict Jesus. Interestingly, the head is placed at groin height compared to the goat man. Whether this was intentional or not is unclear. For these bands, transgression manifests in the form of violent sexual acts against their enemies. Violence alone isn't enough, here being coupled with sexual humiliation, making the victim not only a victim of violence and death, but also an outlet for the sadistic sexuality of this male goat demon persona. In keeping with war metal's perception of being raw, barbaric, and heinous, this is a primal and base act that fits in perfectly with the perceived sonic qualities and lyrical themes of the genre, and an interesting example of Gesamtkunstwerk at work in extreme metal. Before making any conclusions, I'd like to briefly discuss a rather unique aspect of war metal aesthetics, which bridges the gap between album art and fashion. Bullet belts and imagery depicting demons is nothing new for extreme metal, but another aspect that sets these bands apart is their fascination with more contemporary forms of warfare. Medievalism is a documented aspect of black metal, but these bands are less interested in swords and knights and Vikings, and more interested in assault rifles and camo gear. The language used is also evocative of modern military terminology, sometimes. Goatsmegma's album, Goat Separatist Movement, is one such example, which is also a track name on the album, but other tracks such as Sadistically Murdered by Goat Rebels, Satanic Rape Terrorism with Virgin, and Dismembered by Goat Militants bring about the same themes. Abdulbashi's 2020 release, Atomic Triumphator Elite, features not only a goat man with a naked human woman, though she could also be an angel, clinging to his thigh, but he's also wearing bullet belts and also hefting a huge Gatling gun. Both of the figures standing atop a small pile of dead bodies. The previously discussed Blasphemy have also leaned into this aesthetic with a recent compilation release, Ross Bay Cult, which featured 3 re-released albums. All of the re-releases feature white line art atop khaki camo patterns on the album art. Band photos of Blasphemy also include some members wearing gas masks, which is also true of Goatsmegma, whose vocalist has also worn gas masks for live performances. This, alongside the sexually violent imagery and lyrical themes, form a new dimension of war metal's unique aesthetic. It is violent and martial and crude, sometimes hinting at a characterization that's less like a knight and more like a paramilitary extreme metal extremist. However, it should also be acknowledged that this aesthetic is not absent in metal. Bands such as Megadeth, Sodom, and Exodus have used more modern military imagery, though often with anti-war messaging. In this case, these war metal bands are waging their own transgressive war against a nebulous and vaguely holy enemy. Violence and sexual depravity are used in tandem to shock and wage a symbolic conflict. In essence, the war metal is fighting is against sanctity itself, thereby continuing the black metal tradition of anti-religion, and specifically anti-Christian. So, what conclusions can be drawn when reviewing the separate aspects of war metal together? Overall, the theme of transgression is most prevalent. War metal's tactic in the transgressive arms race of extreme metal is a crude form of barbarism that, in itself, can be described through the visual symbol of the lustful, violent, depraved, and sinfully rebellious goat man. In the case of mystical Swedish black metal, the totemic symbol was the serpentine dragon, which stood for misanthropy, Satanism, and religion. In this case, the goat man embodies many similar themes and most certainly stands for a sort of misanthropy, but whereas mystical black metal leaned towards vagueness and mystery, the brutal goat man of war metal and bestial black metal stands for more straightforward primitiveness. One would argue that this is more in keeping with the vision of early black metal bands such as Venom and Hellhammer, who were proudly stripping black metal back to a more primal and rough, vulgar, and raw form. Some questions and topics of a discussion could be explored further, however. Before noting these, I shall summarize the main points made by this video essay so far. First, war metal can be argued to be a genre, as bands such as Blasphemy, Weregoat, and Goatsmegma, among others, are not only similar in terms of sonic qualities of their music compared to other extreme metal bands or subgenres within extreme metal, but also because they explore similar lyrical themes and also utilize similar aesthetics and visual symbolism in their album art and merchandising. It isn't clear, however, if these bands feel more akin to one branch over any others within extreme metal. One might assume that, due to their satanic imagery and themes, they lean more towards black metal. Second, the goat is as versatile a symbol as the serpent, having been utilized in human culture for centuries. The goat in extreme metal unites aspects of the goat as a symbol of male sexual depravity, sinfulness, rebellion, and the devil. It is for these reasons that the goat has been a prevalent image in metal since the 1980s. Third, war metal bands have shown an interest in modern military visuals, leaning away from the more typical metal fascination with medievalism and the past. Instead of swords, these bands have displayed an interest in machine guns and modern military themes. Together, these aspects coalesce to form a uniquely heinous and raw form of intentionally primitive extreme metal. In their lyrics, imagery, and music, these war metal bands emphasize heinousness and depravity, a Gesamtkunstwerk of monstrousness. Further explorations of this theme might include a discussion of what sort of place homoerotic sadomasochism has in extreme metal, as these images more than hint at this theme. On the other hand, the violence and sexual violence depicted against women in these images is also worth discussing with more depth, especially concerning how tongue-in-cheek these bands may or may not be when it comes to their gender politics.